So I will just say I think it's incredibly important to have candidates up and down the ballot here. We need to hear more about other races. It's true that federal races sort of suck all the oxygen out of the room, but so much of what happens and affects our daily lives happens at the local, county, and state level, and if we take our eye off the ball there, we end up in the kind of situation we're in now, where we really feel like we are under constant threat. And so every single election and race matters, and I hope that one of the good things that comes out of the chaos of these past 2 years is that we are all reminded of how important it is to participate in our government at every single level. And I personally am thrilled to be running on a slate of such amazing candidates. I am looking forward to a very great night on November 6th when we are all celebrating, so I hope you'll come out and vote for all of us. I'm really grateful to be here. I'm thrilled to see such a turnout. I'm especially excited to see young people in the room. We talk about young voters and how important they are, but tonight there's really young people in the room, and that's really exciting. One of the things they promised me if I ran for office is I'd get to kiss a lot of babies, and I don't. And I'm really excited there's a baby in the room. I don't know if that baby likes being kissed, but I'm making a beeline for you. So I'm just really excited to be here. I will tell you a little bit about myself, a couple of the issues that I want to work on in Washington, and then I'm just happy to take questions. That's, for me, the best part of an evening like this. But in case you haven't heard any part of my story or read about me, I just want to give you a little insight into why I decided to run for office. For me, it goes back to a slew of experiences in really early childhood. I am one of 4 kids. My older brother and sister are significantly older, so by the time I was 8, they were out of the house. And it was just me and my younger brother, Jonathan. And we are very close in age, less than 2 years apart. So we really grew up together as best friends and playmates. And Jonathan has cognitive disabilities. So I learned some very important things growing up as his sister, moving through the world by his side and experiencing things with him. I spent time, unfortunately, defending him from bullies in our neighborhood. I spent time trying to teach him things that most of us learn very easily and take for granted, things like tying your shoes or telling time. And I spent a lot of time watching my parents, who were incredible advocates for him. When we were kids, the schools weren't really equipped to serve somebody like my brother, so my parents had to work extra hard to make sure he had the best educational opportunities and resources so he could thrive and be successful. And they were phenomenally good at that. And I learned so much from them about perseverance and commitment and love. And the whole takeaway for me from those early years of childhood is how important it is to stand up for the underdog. And that every single one of us has a responsibility to make sure that every person in our society has dignity and access. And I want to serve in Congress because I want to make sure that those very simple but very important ideas are at the heart of our policies and our lawmaking. I don't think we've been doing a great job of that lately. And not just in the past couple of years, but for quite a while in this country. We have really moved away from that idea, and I want to see us re-infuse our government with the commitment to dignity and access. I worked in disability services. I taught there. I was director of education. This was in the nonprofit sector. While doing that work, it became clear to me how important policy was, because I saw the clients that we served come up against barrier after barrier after barrier in our society. And I understood that no matter how good our services were on the individual level, if we didn't address those barriers, the people we served would not achieve success. So I decided to go back to school to study policy. I got into public administration. That brought me to Syracuse in 2003 for the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs. Most recently, what I've been doing there is teaching courses in citizenship and policy and administration and democracy. Pretty good background to decide to get to work in government. I always thought that I would influence policy somehow, but I didn't quite imagine that it would be this way. And then the 2016 election happened, and Donald Trump won, and the things that I saw happening in this country were really upsetting me. And what I tried to do was convince my congressman, my representative in Washington, to be the representative that I needed him to be. to stand up and fight back against the things that were most egregious, the things that were challenging the very fundamentals of our democracy, the things that, in my view, go against what we stand for as Americans. And I needed somebody who was going to be on the right side of the policy issues, who was going to fight for the things that made our lives better. I also needed somebody who was going to engage with us, who was going to show up in a room like this, full of voters, full of constituents, and talk about all the things that are happening at the national level. Unfortunately, my congressman, John Cowley, refused to do any of those things. And eventually it became clear to me that he never would do any of those things. So I decided it was time to encourage him to move on to retirement. And that's how I'm looking at this process. For me, it has been a year-plus long job interview. I think for him, it is a transition into the let's play golf phase of life. So that's why I'm running for office. And there are a lot of things that we need to work on. We have a lot of work to do in this country. The list of things that I want to work on and fight for is a mile long, and I'm happy to talk to you about any of them. I'll just briefly touch on two. When I think about what does day one in Congress look like, after I find the pencils, I will be working on two issues. The first is campaign finance reform. We have got to get big money out of politics. Right now, our political system is driven by big money interests, and that is toxic for our democracy. It means that our elected representatives are not there serving us. They are serving their corporate donors and their mega donors, and John Katko is a perfect example of that. He took $32,000 from the telecom industry and then voted to let companies sell our personal data. He took $113-ish thousand from oil and gas and voted to dump coal ash in our streams. The list goes on and on and on. We need our elected representatives to do what's best for us, not what's best for their mega donors. The other reason it's really important to get money out of politics is because the fact that the system is driven by money keeps a lot of really good people out of running for office. I want to tell you a quick story about when I decided, or before I decided, when I was thinking about running for office. I didn't really know how to do this because it's not something you learn in school or at work. Nobody sits you down and says, so someday if you want to run for office, here's what you do. So I decided I needed to do a little bit of research. And I started calling people who know what it takes to run for Congress. And top of my list was the Democratic Party in Washington, D.C. So I called and I said, hey, I think I want to run for Congress. What do I do first? And they said, take out your cell phone. And I did. And they said, open your contact list. And I did. And they said, can you raise $1 million from that list? No. No. That's the right answer. No. I said, maybe if I'm really nice to everybody this year, I might be able to raise like $10,000 or $15,000. And they said, well, sorry, you can't run for office. Since when is there $1 million entry fee to be able to run for office? The whole premise of our democracy is that any one of us can make our laws. That's what living in a democracy is. And yet somehow we have let our system evolve into this thing where you have to pay an admission fee. And it's a big one. And think about all the people you know who would be amazing legislators, who are passionate and dedicated and smart, and they care about the right things, and they don't give up until they get the job done. Those are the people we need in office. But most of those people won't ever try because they can't get their hands on $1 million. We need Congress to look like us. Until it does, it will not be working for us. So we have got to get big money out of politics. That's number one. Number two is healthcare. We've got to make sure that every person in this country can see a doctor when they need to. It's as simple as that. Right now, we have far too many people who don't have health insurance. We have far too many people who have health insurance but still can't see a doctor. I talked to a gentleman in Williamson a few weeks back. I was doing a town hall there, and on my way in to the event, he was on his way out of the library, and he said, I need to talk to you for a minute about healthcare. I said, what's on your mind? He said, I have health insurance, but I can't see a doctor because my deductible is $4,600. Think about what has to happen to this man for it to make financial sense for him to go to the doctor? Catastrophe, right? So he has insurance. When we look at the numbers and we say who's insured and who's not insured, he's in the good group. But he does not have health care. That man never gets to a doctor. We have to change that. We have to make sure that people have insurance and care. And we have to make sure that people can afford those things. We force far too many families in our own communities, in our own backyards, to make choices like, should I pay the rent or should I take my child to the doctor? Can I buy this medicine for my parent or do I pay the electricity bill? We cannot allow families to face choices like that. We have got to make this accessible to everybody, and we know how to do it. We have the most efficient health insurance program in the entire world. It's Medicare. It is our most popular government program. Everybody loves Medicare. It's not perfect. We need to do some things to make it better. Everybody loves it. Even people who hate government love Medicare. You remember the signs, keep your government hands off my Medicare? Everybody loves Medicare. It is efficient, it is effective, it is cost effective. Right now, we only give it to the people who are the hardest to insure, the most expensive to insure. We give it to people over 65, and we give it to people with permanent disability. Let's give it to the people who are easier and cheaper to insure also. If we do that, if we let everybody into the Medicare system, we bring healthcare costs in this country down by trillions of dollars. And 95% of households will save money on their own personal healthcare costs. We have got to get it done. Those are the two issues I want to work on day one. Day two, we can tackle some other things. So I am asking for your support in this race. I want you to send me to Washington so that I can be the loudest person in the room. Trust me, I can do it. I will be the loudest person in the room, and I will not give up until we get the things that we know are going to make our communities happier and healthier and safer and more prosperous, because that is the world that we deserve to live in, and it is possible. We just have to send the right people to Washington to make it happen. Thank you. Happy to take questions. Issues, campaign, weather.
Your opponent says in his commercials that government takeover, radical government takeover of healthcare,
Yeah.
and also that your taxes are going to double.
Yeah.
And you just now said we're going to save trillions. Did I hear trillions of dollars?
You did.
Over what period of time?
10 years.
Well, you want to say that, but in any event, when are you going to address the distortions that TADCO has made, not only about your stance in healthcare, but also about your residences?
Mm-hmm. So we are addressing his distortions, that's a nice word, his distortions about my personal life, about my policy positions, in commercials that we're putting on TV, in articles and letters in the newspaper, and at every event that I go to, because I get asked about this stuff all the time. So it's worth noting that John Katko's attacks on the idea of Medicare for All are in line with the GOP. They are launching the same attacks all over the country. It's interesting to me that you highlighted the phrase radical government takeover of healthcare. I think that's hilarious. It is, of course, a scare tactic, right? There's a segment of our society who is very opposed to government doing anything. Again, that same segment of society loves Medicare, which is a government program. But what amuses me so much is the logic behind this argument. Because they've also started saying it's going to end Medicare as we know it, right? Can anybody here explain the logic to me of, you know what's going to kill Medicare? Medicare. What is that? It's like if I were to say, you know, I was thinking about building an addition on my house, but I decided not to because it would end my house as we know it. It's ridiculous. What they don't want to talk about is the real cost of healthcare. We all know that costs are out of control. So I said that Medicare for All will save us trillions, and it does. When we talk about the cost of healthcare, we generally talk about it in 10-year horizons. So all the things that you see that, you know, Medicare for All is going to cost $32 trillion, that's over 10 years. What they don't tell you, they're very happy to share that price tag because it's a scary number, right? $32 trillion. What they don't tell you is that if we don't go to Medicare for All and we keep our current system of healthcare, it will cost us over $34 trillion over that same 10-year period. A Medicare for All system saves us trillions. One of the reasons that it does is because Medicare is so much more efficient than the private insurance industry. So if we look at overhead costs in healthcare, in Medicare, the overhead costs, the administrative costs, are under 2%. In the private insurance industry, they range from 12% to 30%. That's because, in addition to the coverage, you are also paying for CEOs' salaries, you are paying for shareholder profits, you are paying for advertising. You don't have to worry about any of that with Medicare. That's why Medicare is the most efficient health insurance delivery system. They don't want to talk about that side of it. They're also now trying to scare people to think that if we make Medicare available to everybody, the people who now have it, seniors, are somehow going to lose their coverage, which is ridiculous. We are not talking about taking away coverage. We are talking about protecting and expanding coverage. And in fact, we're talking about making the coverage better because right now Medicare does not cover dental or vision, right? How many of us know this?
Or hearing aids.
Okay, or hearing aids, right. We are talking about making dental and vision part of the coverage and hearing aids part of the coverage. So we're talking about protecting, expanding, and improving this program, not undermining and destroying it. And I have appeared now twice with John Katko in the last 2 days, and at both events he has accused me of fear-mongering and using scare tactics with voters. And I find that so ironic, because this man in every ad about me is distorting my positions, my personal history, my views on the issues, and telling people that I am going to come and double their taxes and that I am going to destroy Medicare. It is absolutely not the case, and it's just one more building block in the tower that shows us why he's afraid to really talk about the issues, because he knows he can't defend his record. I'm very much looking forward to the time when we're debating on stage so that we can actually have this discussion face to face, but it's going to be a couple weeks. He's agreed to debates in the last about 10 days or so of the race and not before that. So that's when it'll be. And unfortunately, they're all taking place in the city of Syracuse, and they will be pre-recorded in closed studios. No live audiences, no voters. Oh, I know. I know. And believe me, I have been trying. I wanted live audiences so voters could participate. I wanted debates in all 4 counties so we could address the concerns of every community. I wanted this to happen starting in the beginning of October so voters could have time to compare us and think about it. Not surprisingly, Mr. Katko did not agree. Yes?
As someone that utilizes the local VA, what position is yours, or what is your position on privatizing the VA as the current administration wants to do?
Yeah. So I'm opposed to privatization of the VA. I think that there are some circumstances where it may be helpful to make private services or services from private providers available to VA patrons, because there are some communities where the VA resources are too scarce. Here in Central and Western New York, we're pretty lucky with our VA services. We have a few really good quality centers. Almost all of the feedback that I hear from people who utilize our VA services here in Central and Western New York really like them. They are very satisfied with the services they receive, which is fantastic. And one of the reasons I'm concerned about using privatization is that it has the potential to undermine the quality of service that we currently have here in our district. I do recognize that not every part of the country is as lucky as we are. And there are some places where there aren't adequate VA services. And in those instances, it may make sense to give people access to private care. But that should not be a blanket policy. I need to think about it in a more open-minded way than I initially would have, because most of the major veterans organizations in the country supported the bill that you're talking about. And I think it's really important when we're talking about policy that we listen to the stakeholders who are most affected. And if the veterans groups are saying, we like this, that indicates to me there's something here that I'm not aware of yet that I need to understand better. So I am open to learning more about why they support this bill. I have serious reservations about it, and I think especially for communities like ours, it can be really detrimental. But I do recognize the need to address the needs of communities that are not currently served well enough. I don't know that privatization is the answer to that. I think larger reform in the VA is desperately needed. But that has to be part of a bigger conversation. Is that?
Currently, I think, from my perspective, I don't think the VA could be better. I'm extremely happy with it, and really concerned that somebody who has never been in the military is going to decide what they think would be appropriate, and that concerns me big time.
It concerns me too. First of all, I'm thrilled to hear that you have such good experience with the VA, because that's how it should be, right? This is something that we owe to our veterans. It's one of the ways that we try and repay a debt that we can't repay for people like you who dedicate your life to serving your country. I'm thrilled that you are having a good experience, and I'm very grateful that we have that here for our veteran community. I have the same concerns you do about the person who's making decisions. I have concerns about the people that he's choosing to put in charge of the VA to make decisions, but we all know that the agency, that the department, the entire VA, has a lot of problems. I mean, we've seen all the reporting, right? And so we need to get some folks in there who can address it at an administrative level, deal with the management issues, and really make sure that throughout the country, people have access to the same level of service that we have here. That's what I want to see happen. Okay.
You mean rather than President Stockton?
Sorry?
I said you mean rather than the President Stockton?
You know, just, yeah.
When can we get Medicare to make healthcare providers do competitive bidding to bring down prices?
Okay, so costs are a huge problem, right? I was just reading an article yesterday talking about how outrageous our costs are. Reading comparisons, like what an MRI costs here versus what it costs in Switzerland versus what it costs in Sweden. And oh my goodness, it was horrifying. And not just compared to other countries, but even within our own country. I was reading a story of a woman whose daughter has a congenital illness and has very specific and rather intensive medical needs. And so when she needed an MRI, she had to go to a specialized facility where they were able to serve a child with her needs. So this woman who had previously paid for MRIs for, you know, her knee and her husband's shoulder and whatever, they're generally between $500 and $2,000, depending on where you go. First of all, that's already too much of a difference. But they got the bill from this hospital. That one scan, which took a half an hour, was $25,000, right? And they had no idea that bill was coming. And her insurance company covered $1,700 of it because that's what they determined to be a fair price for an MRI. So now this family is on the hook for $23,300, right? The fact that that is not an unusual story in this country is part of what's wrong with our very broken healthcare system. We've got to bring down costs, and there are a few pieces of it. I think the easiest thing we can do to have an immediate impact on costs is deal with prescription drugs by allowing Medicare to negotiate with drug companies, right? So going back to the VA does it. They save 40% on drug costs. We should all get to save 40% on drug costs, right? So we've got to give that power to the government. Congress needs to pass a law. And then we need to address the cost of service. And a huge part of it is just a matter of transparency. The reason that hospitals can get away with that is that they don't publish their prices. Everything is secret. So it's not until you get the bill that you discover, oh, that Band-Aid cost me $600, right? I could have bought a 10-year supply of aspirin at the drugstore for what I paid for that one aspirin in the emergency room, right? And on top of the lack of transparency, they also have you at a moment where you're probably under stress, right? You're in an emergency situation. You just got hit by a car. You can't shop around for the cheapest emergency room, right? You just go where they take you and that's it. And so there is a very different set of information, what the hospital and the doctors have versus what you as the patient have. And we don't tolerate that in really any other area of consumerism, right? One of the things that government can do is demand transparency for people so that we can make educated and informed decisions. And if you want to choose the $25,000 MRI, by all means. But you should know that it's a $25,000 MRI before you do it, right? So these are some of the things that government can get in there to do that will help bring down the costs, which of course is the other side of the equation. We have to increase access and we have to decrease costs.
What are your thoughts on tighter gun control legislation?
Okay, so we have a very serious problem in this country with gun violence. We see it every day. It's become sort of a top of the list conversation largely because of the school shootings that we've had. And we have seen these horrific massacres of children. Those are traumatic events. They are traumatic for all of us, even if we're not there to experience them personally. It's a trauma for the nation. But it represents a really small part of the gun violence problem. Gun violence is about the people who kill themselves every day with guns, most of whom are white men. Gun violence is about the women who are shot and killed by intimate partners with guns every day. Gun violence is about our children not being able to play in their front yards because bullets are whizzing through their neighborhoods. In the city of Syracuse, we've had 3 children shot, 2 of whom died in the last week. Children. This is a problem that touches every segment of our community, and we've got to deal with it. I support the Second Amendment. I respect the tradition in this country of gun ownership and hunting and fishing and family protection. That is not incompatible with common sense gun safety measures. And where I believe we need to start is with universal background checks. We have to make sure that every single person who buys a gun in this country, regardless of where or how they buy it, has a background check. We know that that helps reduce the incidence of gun violence. It is the best way that we can keep guns out of the hands of people who can't be responsible gun owners. And it is not a controversial policy. 97% of Americans agree with this policy. 97%, right? I don't agree with myself 97% of the time. By interests that do not align with our interests as the people. And that's really the system that we're stuck in right now. And you're right, it's cyclical. Because the people with the money help elect the politicians who are going to vote in the interests of the people with the money.
And so entrenched, I mean, that's part
Yes,
of
that's exactly right. And then we had the Citizens United decision from the Supreme Court, which unleashed a level of spending that we couldn't have imagined previously. And we have essentially legalized bribery in our political system. So ultimately the answer is to overturn Citizens United. That requires a constitutional amendment, which is a long-term project. That's not an easy thing to do, and it shouldn't be an easy thing to do, right? Amending our founding document. So I will do whatever I can to help get us to the constitutional amendment. But that's a long-term project. In the meantime, we have to tackle this problem legislatively. And because of the Citizens United decision, we can't completely eliminate money from politics. But we can make a lot of headway in reducing its impact. So I will point you to my website if you'd like to look. I published a campaign finance and government reform agenda that outlines a series of specific pieces of legislation that I support and that I will work to pass in Congress to deal with this problem. Some of the things that we can do legislatively are increased disclosure requirements, right? So there's one piece of legislation called the Disclosure Act, which says if you spend more than $10,000 on a political ad, you must disclose your donors. And that means that when we see an ad on TV where the Koch brothers are telling us, this tax cut's really good for you middle class folks, we get to know it's the Koch brothers who are saying that. Because right now we don't. And we should know, because that helps us evaluate the veracity of the message, right? So that's one thing we can do. Another thing we can do is start working on public financing of elections. There are programs all over the country. New York City has one that's been running for a really long time for city council races, where there's a 6-to-1 match for small dollar donors. So if you have $100 you want to give to a candidate, you make that donation, and then the government kicks in $600 more to that candidate. So your $100 donation actually leverages $700 in funding to that candidate. Now all of a sudden, that candidate cares a lot more about what you have to say, right? And if you can get a room full of 40 $100 donors, you bet that candidate's showing up to talk to that room full of people. So this is one way that we can balance out the power between the small dollar donor and the large dollar donor. And in communities where they've used these public financing plans, they have tremendous success. And there are lots of variations. In Seattle, they do it differently, where they give you vouchers. So I believe each resident gets $10, $25 vouchers, and you give those coupons to the campaigns that you want to donate to, right? So it's a different mechanism, but the same idea. So we can shine a light on dark money through disclosure in donations and advertising and other things. And we can start employing some public financing plans to help give the small dollar donors more power. And I will just say that, as I mentioned, this is my #1 priority. I think this is key to restoring the health of our democracy. I have joined in with 106 other Democratic candidates running for Congress this year who have signed on to a letter that we submitted to the leadership in the House, the Democratic leadership in the House, demanding that this issue, campaign finance reform, is the first issue that the 116th Congress takes up in January. And we included in that letter a whole series of specific actions that we want taken. This is a very serious commitment, and we are laying it out before we're even in office. So this is something that's going to happen.
Dana, can I say something about this?
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt, but I just want to say that also I sort of ran my race against cynicism in general, and one of the things that turned up was that even though I was outspent 4-1, I still won. I believe that the other piece of how to fight back against this is that ordinary citizens are sick and tired of the amount of money that's being poured into campaigns, and they're tuning out the commercials, and they are angry about the robocalls and that sort of thing. And so it's grassroots, people going door to door that are really making the difference in campaigns now. And so if we can multiply that effect and really get involved in talking to people, I think people prefer not to be targets of campaigns, they want to be participants in the political process. And so all of you in this room have the opportunity to be part of making that change. And Dana's campaign has been amazing in creating that change here locally. And it's tempering what cynicism I had before, making me feel really optimistic about our ability to take our democracy back.
I also, in my primary, also was outspent 4-1. This is another thing that Rachel and I have in common. I was outspent 4-1 by my opponent and won. And I think that's not only our campaigns, but it's what's sweeping across the whole country, right? The idea that the people are rising up to take their government and their politics back. And it's very powerful. It makes it an incredible time to be running. It really does. Do we have more time? I don't know. I could do this all night, but.
It's gone over a little bit, but I think what I'd like to do is, just we can break down, we've got tons of